The Anabaptist movement of the 16th century was one of the most radical offshoots of the Protestant Reformation, characterized by its distinctive theological beliefs, particularly regarding adult baptism. However, one of the often overlooked aspects of the movement was its deeply ingrained apocalyptic outlook. The Anabaptists were heavily influenced by the social, political, and religious turbulence of their time, interpreting their circumstances through the lens of biblical prophecy. This article explores the apocalyptic context of the Anabaptist movement, highlighting how their beliefs regarding the end times shaped their theology, community practices, and revolutionary activities. The Anabaptist movement originated in the early 16th century, during a period of intense religious upheaval known as the Protestant Reformation. Reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin called for a break from the Catholic Church's practices, which they saw as corrupt and unbiblical. The early Anabaptists, like the Protestant Reformers, sought to return to a purer form of Christianity based on the teachings of the Bible. However, they went much further than Luther or Calvin in their rejection of traditional practices. The term Anabaptist comes from the Greek words ana, again, and baptizo, to baptize, meaning rebaptizer. This name was given to the movement because of its insistence on adult baptism. Anabaptists rejected infant baptism, believing that only adults could make a conscious decision to follow Christ. This belief led them to rebaptize those who had been baptized as infants, a practice considered heretical by both Catholic and Protestant authorities. The Anabaptists were also radical in their views on the separation of church and state. They believed that the church should be a voluntary community of believers, independent of government control. This put them at odds with the mainstream Protestant reformers, who maintained close ties with secular rulers. Anabaptists also promoted pacifism, communal living, and a rejection of worldly goods, emphasizing a literal adherence to the teachings of Christ. Underlying much of Anabaptist theology was a fervent belief in the imminent return of Christ and the coming judgment. The movement's leaders believed they were living in the final days of history, and that the corruption of the established churches was a sign of the impending apocalypse. This apocalyptic worldview gave the Anabaptists a sense of urgency in their mission to restore true Christianity. They saw themselves as a remnant of faithful believers, tasked with preparing for Christ's return. The apocalyptic imagination was not unique to the Anabaptists but was widespread across various radical Reformation groups. The political and social chaos of 16th-century Europe, marked by wars, famine, and religious persecution, fueled widespread expectations of the end times. Many Christians, including the Anabaptists, saw these events as signs of God's impending judgment on a sinful world. The Anabaptists drew heavily on biblical prophecy, particularly from the books of Daniel and Revelation, to interpret their current events. These texts, with their vivid imagery of beasts, dragons, and cosmic battles, were seen as describing the struggle between the forces of God and the forces of Satan in the final days. The Anabaptists identified themselves with the faithful remnant described in these books, and their opponents, Catholic and Protestant alike, as the forces of the Antichrist. In the Anabaptist interpretation, the establishment of Christ's millennial kingdom was imminent. They believed that Christ would soon return to overthrow the existing powers and establish a new, just order on earth. For many Anabaptists, this new order would be characterized by a radical egalitarianism, communal living, and a rejection of worldly authority. Their commitment to these ideals often led to conflict with both secular and religious authorities, who saw the Anabaptists as a threat to the social order. The apocalyptic expectations of the Anabaptist movement were often shaped and intensified by charismatic leaders who claimed to have special revelation from God. Figures like Thomas Müntzer, Melchior Hoffman, and Jan Matthys proclaimed that they were prophets sent by God to lead the faithful through the tribulation and into the kingdom of Christ. These leaders were often highly influential, attracting large followings with their fiery rhetoric and radical visions of social and religious transformation. For example, Melchior Hoffman, an Anabaptist leader in Strasbourg, believed that he had been divinely chosen to announce the imminent return of Christ. He predicted that Christ would return in 1533 and establish his kingdom on earth, with Strasbourg as the New Jerusalem. Hoffman's apocalyptic preaching inspired many followers, some of whom took up arms in preparation for the final battle between the forces of God and Satan. Though Hoffman's predictions did not come to pass, his influence on the Anabaptist movement was profound, particularly in shaping its apocalyptic fervor. One of the most infamous expressions of Anabaptist apocalypticism was the Munster Rebellion of 1534 to 1535. Led by radical Anabaptist prophets Jan Matthys and John of Leyden, the rebellion sought to establish a theocratic kingdom in the German city of Munster. The leaders proclaimed that Munster was the New Jerusalem and that Christ's return was imminent. They encouraged their followers to prepare for the final battle between the forces of good and evil. The Munster Rebellion began when Anabaptists took control of the city in 1534, expelling the Catholic bishop and his supporters. Jan Matthys declared that Munster would be the site of the New Jerusalem, and he called on Anabaptists from across Europe to flock to the city in preparation for Christ's return. Under his leadership, the Anabaptists established a communal society, abolishing private property and practicing polygamy. As the rebellion progressed, the apocalyptic rhetoric intensified. Matthys and his successor, John of Leyden, predicted that the forces of the Antichrist, represented by the Catholic Church and secular authorities, would soon besiege the city, but that God would deliver the faithful through divine intervention. However, the reality was far less miraculous. The city was besieged by Catholic and Protestant forces, and after months of starvation and suffering, the rebellion was crushed in 1535. The Munster Rebellion was a turning point for the Anabaptist movement. The violent excesses of the rebellion, particularly its apocalyptic fanaticism and social radicalism, discredited the movement in the eyes of many. Both Catholic and Protestant authorities used the rebellion as justification for harsh persecution of Anabaptists, who were seen as dangerous revolutionaries. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the Anabaptist movement underwent a period of reflection and reformation. Leaders like Menno Simons advocated a more pacifist and spiritual interpretation of Anabaptism, emphasizing non-violence, separation from the world, and a focus on personal holiness rather than political revolution. This more moderate form of Anabaptism eventually became known as Mennonitism and continues to this day. While the Munster Rebellion was the most dramatic example of Anabaptist apocalypticism, it was not the only one. Throughout the 16th century, various Anabaptist groups continued to preach the imminent return of Christ and the establishment of a millennial kingdom on earth. These apocalyptic expectations influenced both their theology and their social practices. For many Anabaptists, the persecution they faced from both Catholic and Protestant authorities was seen as a sign of their faithfulness to Christ. They believed that their suffering was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, particularly the warnings of Jesus that his followers would face persecution in the last days. Martyrdom was viewed as a mark of true discipleship, and many Anabaptists went willingly to their deaths, confident that they would be vindicated in the coming kingdom of God. The martyrdom of Anabaptists also served as a powerful tool for the spread of their message. Accounts of their trials and executions were widely circulated in books and pamphlets, inspiring others to join the movement. These stories often emphasized the apocalyptic nature of the Anabaptist witness, portraying the martyrs as soldiers in the final battle between the forces of God and Satan. The Anabaptist belief in the imminent return of Christ also led to the formation of eschatological communities, groups of believers who sought to live as if they were already part of the coming kingdom of God. These communities were characterized by a radical commitment to pacifism, communal living, and the rejection of private property. They sought to model their lives on the teachings of Christ, particularly his call to love one's enemies and to care for the poor. One of the most famous of these communities was the Hutterites, who established communal settlements in Moravia. The Hutterites believed that their way of life was a foretaste of the millennial kingdom that Christ would soon establish. Despite facing severe persecution, they maintained their communal practices, viewing their suffering as a sign that the end was near. The apocalyptic context of the Anabaptist movement was both a source of inspiration and a cause of controversy. On one hand, it gave the movement a sense of urgency and purpose, motivating its followers to endure persecution and to strive for a radical reformation of church and society. On the other hand, it led to violent excesses like the Munster Rebellion, which discredited the movement and contributed to its marginalization. Despite these challenges, the Anabaptist legacy of apocalypticism continues to influence contemporary Christian thought. The emphasis on living out the values of the coming kingdom, the rejection of worldly power, and the commitment to peace and justice remain central to many Anabaptist communities today.